Hello and welcome to the Dead Presidents Podcast. I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I'm James J. Hamilton.
And these are the top 5 Secretaries of State.
5, we're about to take a dive. 4, in the presidential law. 3, who will fuck I be? 2, we're about to tell you. 1, the show's not begun.
Welcome to the Dead Presidents Podcast. Back with another exciting top 5.
Indeed we are. We're going to explore the top 5 Secretaries of State. A lofty and important position.
Yep.
That's been held by many.
Many very prominent Americans. Perhaps the top cabinet post.
For a long time, the stepping stone to the presidency.
Indeed. America's chief diplomat.
Yeah.
Our foreign minister.
And so, we're going to take a look at the 5 guys who really made a mark on this position. Starting with the top 5 Secretaries of State.
Number 5.
Hamilton Fish.
Hamilton Fish. He was born to a prominent New York family, graduated Columbia College, and became a lawyer before launching his political career as a member of the Whig Party. He was in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was Lieutenant Governor of New York and then Governor of New York. He then joined the U.S. Senate in 1851, serving on the Foreign Relations Committee. And after the Whig Party
dissolved,
came apart at the seams,
they died.
Hamilton Fish became a Republican. And during the Civil War, he served on New York's Union Defense Committee and was a commissioner who helped establish the Union Confederate Prisoner Exchange Program.
Yeah, and he's actually going to retire from public life after the war. But in 1869, he accepts President Grant's offer to become Secretary of State. As Grant biographer Ron Chernow put it, quote, "In a cabinet plagued by high turnover, Fish would labor for 8 years, lending gravity to American foreign policy and riding out many controversies. He functioned on such confidential terms with Grant that he almost ranked as his prime minister. Steeped in statecraft, he would master reams of information, keep a voluminous diary, and tutor Grant in the mysterious ways of diplomacy. For Grant, Fish was a godsend, compensating for his own glaring inexperience in foreign affairs. Grant would later boast with some justice that Hamilton Fish was the best Secretary of State in 50 years.
High praise.
Indeed. Fish reorganized the State Department's record-keeping practices and implemented civil service reform, utilizing the merit system in promotions.
Wow. Well, perhaps his greatest achievement was the resolution of the Alabama claims, those being, of course, the American reparation claims against Britain for depredations caused by Confederate warships, particularly the CSS Alabama, that were constructed in British shipyards in violation of Britain's official neutrality in the Civil War. The Johnson administration had tried to negotiate a settlement, but radical Republicans led by Charles Sumner believed that Britain should be held responsible for the entire cost of the war after Gettysburg, arguing that the Confederacy could not have survived without the lifeline they received from those warships procured from Britain. Sumner demanded that Britain either pay $2 billion or cede Canada in response.
Yeah.
Pretty high negotiating position.
That's just it. Fish welcomes a British diplomatic commission to Washington, D.C., and he negotiates the Treaty of Washington, which agrees to submit the Alabama claims to international arbitration. The treaty was ratified by the Senate, and the following year, the arbitration tribunal met in Switzerland and awarded the U.S. $15.5 million. The arbitration solution allowed the Grant administration to maintain a tough public stance, never backing off the position that Britain should pay astronomical damages, while at the same time knowing that the arbitration tribunal would settle on a more reasonable sum.
Yeah, that position that Sumner was banging the table on was pretty popular. The American people were very pissed about that.
Indeed.
And the Grant administration didn't want to have to back off that position, but by going to arbitration, they never had to back off.
Yeah, it was a pretty good move.
They got it done while at the same time never having to back off of what the American people wanted.
That's it. And the treaty also established separate arbitrations over fishing rights in Canadian waters and a dispute over the San Juan Islands, located between Vancouver Island and Washington State. The treaty has been hailed for pioneering the effective use of international arbitration and for setting influential precedents on the wartime obligations of neutral countries.
Very important.
Indeed.
Secretary of State Fish also advised Grant against pursuing the annexation of Santo Domingo, although the obsessed Grant ignored Fish's advice. Fish agreed to push the Santo Domingo agenda, though, and advised Grant that he should withdraw the demand for Santo Domingo statehood if he wanted to get Senate approval. Grant ignored that advice, and the proposed treaty died in the Senate. When Cubans then rebelled against their Spanish colonial government, Fish helped prevent war with Spain by persuading Grant and Congress not to recognize the Cuban rebels as belligerents.
Yeah.
And when Spain ended up catching a privately owned American ship, the Virginius, that was running guns to Cuban rebels, it executed a lot of the crew members, which included some Americans.
Ugh.
Outraged Americans demanded war with Spain, but again, Hamilton Fish negotiating a peaceful resolution whereby Spain returned the Virginius, released its remaining prisoners, paid reparations, and censured the captain who ordered the executions.
Yeah.
Cooler head prevailing.
Indeed. Solid moves by Hamilton Fish, who also presided over a peace conference that resulted in an armistice between Spain and its former colonies of Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia. He also negotiated a trade reciprocity treaty with the Kingdom of Hawaii that would pave the way towards Hawaii's eventual annexation. He offered his resignation several times due to poor health, but Grant was so reliant on Fish that he prevailed upon him to stay. He needed Hamilton Fish.
He was the indispensable man of the Grant cabinet.
He was the anchor of the Grant cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
Grant actually wanted Fish to succeed him as president and sent a letter to the 1876 Republican National Convention urging them to nominate him, but the convention never considered him. Fish retired from public life and died in 1893. His son, grandson, and great-grandson, that's Hamilton Fish II, III, and IV, would all go on to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Wow. The House, a long line of Hamilton Fishes.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's 1, 2, 3, and 4 Hamilton Fishes all in the House of Representatives.
That's it.
I'd venture to guess that has not happened with any other one line of names.
I don't think so. It sounds almost like a Dr. Seuss book, but that's going to bring us to the top 5 Secretaries of State.
Number 4.
William Seward.
William Seward. He worked as a lawyer, and he was a prominent anti-slavery advocate during his service in the New York State Legislature, as New York's governor, and in the U.S. Senate. Then, in 1860, he was the front-runner for the Republican presidential nomination. However, the convention compromised on some dude named Abraham Lincoln. And while assembling his famous team of rivals cabinet, Lincoln named his most prominent rival, Seward, to the most prominent cabinet position, Secretary of State.
That's it. Seward's top diplomatic priority was to prevent foreign countries from recognizing Confederate independence. He sent forceful instructions to Charles Francis Adams, the U.S. ambassador in London, threatening war against Britain if it recognized the Confederacy. Ultimately, Britain and France recognized the Confederacy as a belligerent under international law, but not as a sovereign nation, and refused to receive its diplomats. Britain also accepted the Union blockade of Confederate ports. When a U.S. Navy ship boarded a British mail ship and removed 2 Confederate diplomats, Britain was outraged by the violation of its sovereignty and considered war. Seward diffused the situation by persuading Lincoln to disavow the Navy captain's actions and release the Confederate diplomats. He negotiated a treaty with Britain whereby the 2 countries would cooperate in preventing the smuggling of contraband slaves. After Confederate warships constructed in private British shipyards, notably the CSS Alabama, began ravaging Union shipping, Seward persuaded the British government to seize 2 additional ships that were nearing completion and halt further construction.
Well, those post-war reparations could have been even higher. Seward didn't help get that nipped in the bud.
Indeed.
Also, Seward's State Department was in charge of handling wartime detentions where habeas corpus was suspended during the first year of the war, after which that job went to the War Department. But in September 1861, Seward ordered the imprisonment of some Maryland state legislators who were planning to hold a vote for Maryland's secession. And, he initially had reservations about the inexperienced Lincoln, and he resented being passed over for the Republican presidential nomination.
Yeah.
He was a bigger deal. He thought it should have been him, but he would come to admire Lincoln and become his most faithful ally and his closest advisor in the cabinet. Lincoln would seek his advice on a wide range of matters outside the purview of the State Department, often inciting jealousy in other cabinet members. In 1862, Seward advised Lincoln to wait for a Union military victory before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, not wanting it to seem desperate. Lincoln agreed, waiting till after the victorious Battle of Antietam to issue that proclamation. And in 1864, Seward joined Lincoln in meeting with Confederate envoys, including Vice President Alexander Stephens, at the Hampton Roads Conference, although those negotiations went nowhere when the Confederates refused to consider giving up their independence.
Yeah. That brings us to April 5th, 1865, when Seward breaks his jaw in a carriage accident.
Ouch.
9 days later, while John Wilkes Booth was assassinating Lincoln, co-conspirator Lewis Powell, a.k.a. Lewis Payne, invaded Seward's home and attacked him with a Bowie knife. Seward was grievously wounded, but the splint on his broken jaw protected his throat from being cut. Seward remained in office as Secretary of State throughout the Johnson administration. Though Johnson ignored much of his advice on Reconstruction, Seward was generally inclined to see Johnson's generous treatment of the South as being in line with Lincoln's conciliatory approach. Seward stood behind Johnson and recommended that he hire New York lawyer William Evarts, who would lead Johnson's successful impeachment defense.
Well, Johnson rewarded Seward's support by deferring to him on all foreign policy questions. During the Civil War, France had occupied Mexico and installed a puppet government, a blatant affront to the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah.
We're a little too busy at the time, but after the war, many Americans favored an invasion of Mexico to oust the French. Seward favored diplomacy, and the hot-headed Johnson deferred to his Secretary of State. Seward warned the French that their presence in Mexico was unacceptable. Their leader, Napoleon III, agreed to withdraw French troops within 18 months, hoping that by then his puppet government could consolidate its own power against Mexican Republican insurgency. But the U.S. supplied the Republican rebels with arms, recognized the Republican leader as the legitimate president of Mexico, and stationed a Union army under General Phil Sheridan on the Texas border. Under this pressure, the French position collapsed. In less than a year, French troops were withdrawn and their puppet emperor was executed by a Mexican firing squad.
Them's the breaks.
That's what happens when you affront the Monroe Doctrine.
That's it. In 1864, Seward entered negotiations to purchase Alaska from Russia, which worried that its colony could be easily taken by the British. In 1867, Seward agreed to pay $7.2 million for Alaska, and the Senate ratified the purchase by a large margin. At the time, some considered it useless land and dubbed the purchase Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. It remained largely uninhabited until gold was discovered there in the 1890s, leading, of course, to a gold rush.
Nice.
Later on, oil is discovered. And up from the ice comes a bubbling crude. It became a territory in 1912 and was admitted as the 49th state in 1959.
Ended up being a pretty good deal.
Yeah, not too shabby.
Seward would endorse Grant for president in 1868 and retire from public life. He went on a bit of a world tour, traveled across the United States on the Transcontinental Railroad, and then visited Japan, China, India, the Middle East, and Europe, all before his death in 1872.
And that's going to bring us around to the top 5 Secretaries of State.
Number 3.
Daniel Webster. One of the leading lawyers of his era. One of the greatest orators in American history. Webster served in the House of Representatives from 1813 to 1817 and again from 1823 to 1827. He then represented Massachusetts in the Senate from 1827 to 1841, when the new Whig president, William Henry Harrison, named him Secretary of State. Harrison promptly died, and when his successor, John Tyler, refused to follow the Whig party line, every member of his cabinet resigned, except Webster, who stuck around because he wanted to declare his independence from Whig Party leader Henry Clay, and because he was working on a major treaty with Britain.
Yep, there's a lot of problems going on at this time. Tensions were high between the two countries, and war was a real possibility. Disagreements over the border between the U.S. and Canada had erupted into violence in Maine when Americans sent aid to Canadian rebels on the ship Caroline. British forces set the ship on fire and sent it over Niagara Falls
Right over
on
the falls.
fire.
Yeah.
American Southerners at the time feared the influence of British abolitionists and denounced Britain's refusal to extradite mutinous slaves who took over the slave ship Creole and found safe haven in the British Bahamas. Britain threatened to recall its ambassador, and President Tyler threatened to not let the ambassador out of the country if he was recalled.
Secretary of State Webster led the effort to prevent war and resolve the two countries' differences. He works with the British diplomat Lord Ashburton, and in August 1842 they concluded the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. The treaty settled the Maine-New Brunswick border, the Canada-Minnesota border, established the 49th parallel as the border as far as the Rocky Mountains, allowed shared use of the Great Lakes, defined 7 crimes subject to extradition between the two countries, not including slave revolt or mutiny, ignored the Creole controversy. Britain would later pay some restitution in a broader claim settlement treaty concluded in 1853, agreed to joint cooperation in ending the international slave trade. The Oregon border question was left unresolved, a delay which allowed the American position to become stronger as more Americans settled there. There was strong opposition to the treaty in Maine, and Webster had Tyler give him access to $17,000 in executive funds, with which he launched a propaganda campaign that filled newspapers with coverage favorable to compromise, and leaked a copy of an old map allegedly drawn by Benjamin Franklin that made the treaty look like a good deal. Tyler submitted the treaty to the Senate, where some complained that it gave away too much territory, but it was easily ratified by a vote of 39-9.
Webster getting the job done. He also worked to extend American influence in the Pacific. Under his stewardship, the Tyler administration recognized the independence of the Kingdom of Hawaii and extended the Monroe Doctrine to oppose any European colonial influence over Hawaii. Webster also sent the first American diplomat to China, which led to a treaty that opened American trade with China, setting tariffs and granting the U.S. most favored nation status. Webster resigned from the cabinet in 1843, allowing Tyler to appoint a Southerner who would push his next foreign policy priority, the annexation of Texas, which Webster opposed.
Yeah. Webster is going to return to the Senate, and in 1850, he's named Secretary of State once more by President Fillmore, who relied heavily on Webster as his closest advisor. In 1852, Fillmore dispatched Commodore Matthew Perry with a fleet of warships to open relations with Japan, and Webster drafted instructions giving Perry vast discretion and authorizing him to use force. Perry used intimidation to force the Japanese to the negotiating table, and the Japanese, knowing they were powerless to resist the U.S. Navy, agreed to virtually all of Fillmore's demands. Perry negotiated the Treaty of Kanagawa, which opened 2 Japanese ports to American trade, ensured protection for American sailors, and established an American consulate. Fillmore and Webster also asserted the Monroe Doctrine to oppose a French incursion in Hawaii and British influence in Central America.
Nice. Well, Webster was also a strong supporter of President Fillmore's efforts to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act in the North, hoping to preserve the Union from Southern secession threats by proving that the North would protect slavery, not his finest hour. Also, Webster ran for president in 1852, and he succeeded only in stubbornly blocking his ally Fillmore from winning the Whig nomination.
That's it.
Another not fine hour that resulted in Winfield Scott winning the nomination, getting crushed by the Democrat Franklin Pierce. Webster died before the election, distraught that he had cost Fillmore a chance to be reelected.
Yeah, it actually kind of bummed him out.
Yep. Things
Well.
ended on a low note for Webster, but he had a lot of high notes prior to that.
Indeed. And that's going to bring us to the top 5 Secretaries of State.
Number 2.
George Marshall.
Marshall graduated from the Virginia Military Institute, served in the Philippines, and fought in World War I. He remained in the Army and got promoted to general. He was sworn in as Army Chief of Staff on September 1st, 1939, which just happened to be the same day that Germany invaded Poland.
Yeah.
Marshall served as Chief of Staff throughout World War II, presiding over a 4,000% expansion of the Army.
Think about that.
Pretty huge. He was instrumental in planning the Normandy invasion and in the selection of some of the top battlefield commanders, including Dwight Eisenhower, George Patton, Omar Bradley. After the war, Marshall served as a special envoy to China and tried unsuccessfully to negotiate a coalition government between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong that would have ended the Chinese Civil War.
Yeah. In January 1947, President Truman names Marshall Secretary of State. At the time, many allies favor harsh punishment of Germany, and many Americans favor a return to isolationism. Europe had been devastated by war, and its poor economic conditions formed a breeding ground for communist sentiments. Marshall promoted a visionary plan to rebuild Europe with American aid. In a speech at Harvard in July 1947, he said, quote, "The truth of the matter is that Europe's requirements for the next 3 or 4 years of foreign food and other essential products, principally from America, are so much greater than her present ability to pay that she must have substantial additional help or face economic, social, and political deterioration of a very grave character. The remedy lies in breaking the vicious circle and restoring the confidence of the European people in the economic future of their own countries and of Europe as a whole."
The European Recovery Program, which became known as the Marshall Plan, was approved by Congress in 1948. It provided $13 billion in aid to 18 European countries, including West Germany, and facilitated trade agreements, loan repayment, and industrialization. The Soviet Union refused to participate, and as the battle lines of the Cold War were being drawn, rejected American aid for countries within its sphere of influence and adopted a punitive policy toward East Germany. Over the next several years, Western Europe experienced the fastest period of growth in its history. Industrial production rose by 40%, gross national product rose 32.5%, and trade increased 40%. Communist influence decreased. The plan also increased American influence in Europe and subtly Americanized European countries through increased exposure to American popular culture, such as Hollywood movies. The plan also laid the groundwork for the European Union and has been considered the most successful foreign aid program of the 20th century. In 1953, Marshall was given the Nobel Peace Prize for his post-war efforts.
A lofty achievement.
Indeed.
As Secretary of State, Marshall helped negotiate the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, a mutual defense pact between the United States and many South and Central American countries. He also supported the negotiations that shortly after his tenure led to the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty and the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. He helped formulate the Truman Doctrine, which pledged American support for countries threatened by the spread of communism and American aid to anti-communist regimes. Along with Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson, who would be his successor and is an honorable mention on this top 5, Marshall helped to develop the domino theory of the danger posed by the spread of communism.
Marshall opposed Truman's support for an independent state of Israel, arguing that it would lead to war, but Truman didn't follow his advice. War would break out one day after Israel declared independence, and many times since. At Marshall's urging, Truman demanded that the Netherlands cease its invasion of its former colony, Indonesia, which had declared independence in 1945. When the Netherlands refused, its Marshall Plan aid was put on hold, and a couple years later, the Netherlands recognized Indonesian independence. Marshall resigned from the State Department in January 1949 due to poor health.
Yeah. And following the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, Marshall agreed to become Secretary of Defense, where he served for 1 year, helping to organize the war effort and supporting Truman's firing of General Douglas MacArthur. Truman had some great words on that. George Marshall retired in 1951 and served as chairman of the American Battle Monuments Commission until his death in 1959.
A great American.
Indeed. And that's going to bring us on down to the top 5 Secretaries of State.
Number 1.
John Quincy Adams. 6 presidents have served as Secretary of State, but JQA is the only one to make our top 5. By the time he became Secretary of State, Adams was already the most experienced diplomat in American history. He accompanied his father on diplomatic missions to France and the Netherlands during the Revolution, and at the age of 14, became secretary to the U.S. Minister to Russia. After graduating Harvard and becoming a lawyer, he served as minister to the Netherlands from 1794 to 1797, then as minister to Prussia from 97 to 1801. He spent 6 years in the U.S. Senate, then served as minister to Russia from 1809 to 1814. After serving on the commission that negotiated the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, he served as minister to Britain from 1815 to 1817, when President Monroe named him Secretary of State.
At the time, the United States had been trying to buy Florida from Spain way back since the Louisiana Purchase, and Spain had steadfastly refused to sell it. In 1817, Seminole Indians were raiding out of Florida into U.S. territory with Spanish support and encouragement. Monroe appointed Andrew Jackson to lead a punitive expedition against the Indians, but Jackson went further than that, and he attacked and seized Pensacola, the Spanish capital of Florida. He also summarily executed 2 British subjects who allegedly incited Indians against the United States. Treasury Secretary William Crawford and War Secretary John C. Calhoun urged Monroe to condemn Jackson for exceeding his orders and potentially damaging relations with Spain and Britain.
That's right. But Adams advised Monroe to back Jackson because his tough actions had public support, and Adams believed would strengthen the U.S. bargaining position with Spain and Britain. Monroe sides with Adams and backs Jackson. Adams seemed to be proven right because he soon concluded 3 important treaties. In 1818, the U.S. made 2 treaties with Britain, one that demilitarized the Great Lakes region and one that granted American fishing rights in certain Canadian waters and fixed the U.S.-Canada boundary from Minnesota to the Rocky Mountains. As a senator in 1803, Adams had led the opposition that defeated a proposal to settle the U.S.-Canada border, and as Secretary of State, he succeeded in obtaining a much more favorable settlement.
And then in 1819, he and Spanish diplomat Luis Onís negotiated the Adams-Onís Treaty, by which Spain finally sold Florida to the United States for $5 million, and the 2 countries finally agreed on the border between Louisiana and Spanish Texas, which had been hotly disputed since the Louisiana Purchase. And with the decades-long European War over, and former Spanish colonies in Mexico and South America having won their independence, Secretary of State Adams and President Monroe saw that the United States was at a turning point and was now ready to assert itself as a power on the world stage. The United States would pivot from a Eurocentric foreign policy to one focused on the Western Hemisphere and westward expansion.
Yeah, that's it. Concerned that Spain may attempt to reassert its authority over its former colonies, or that Russia may extend its Alaska claim into the Oregon Territory, Adams and Monroe crafted a policy against European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. Britain, which wanted to continue free trade with former Spanish colonies, proposed making a joint declaration with the U.S., but Adams advised against that. He favored making a unilateral declaration that the Western Hemisphere was an American sphere of influence and was off limits to new colonization efforts by European powers. He said, quote, "It would be more candid, as well as more dignified, to avow our principles explicitly than to come in as a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war."
Well, Monroe agreed, and in his 1823 State of the Union address, he announced the Monroe Doctrine in language written mostly by Secretary of State Adams.
Yeah.
Quote, "The occasion has been judged proper for asserting, as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power we have not interfered and shall not interfere, but with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States."
And there it is.
Boom.
It's going to come up again and again.
Yeah, as we saw in the other top 5 Secretaries of State, a lot of them involved with upholding the Monroe Doctrine.
Just supremely important.
This is where it all began.
Yeah,
one of, if
it.
not the most critical principles in American foreign policy history.
Absolutely. Now, some of the European powers are angered by the declaration, but Britain supports it because British merchants would dominate free trade. Latin American countries were generally supportive, but some far-sighted Latin Americans worried that European colonizers would be replaced by United States domination. The Monroe Doctrine became a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, was cited by many future presidents as the U.S. became an expansionist imperialist power that eventually came to dominate the European powers that once dominated it.
The tables have turned.
Indeed. And they've turned thanks to largely the part of John Quincy Adams.
Yep. And
our number 1 Secretary of State.
Yep. And of course he went on to become president and enjoyed one of, if not the most successful post-presidential careers.
Indeed.
As you will recall from episode 6 of this illustrious podcast.
Absolutely. That's going to bring us to the end of our top 5 this month. This has been the top 5 Secretaries of State. I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I'm James Shea Hamilton.
You've been listening to the Dead Presidents Podcast. Just like you're told to.